The ravens woke before the men did. Their claws clicked along the ledge outside the rookery like hail on slate. Black shapes hunched against snow that sifted down from a sky made of iron. Samwell Tarly listened to them stir and mutter as he held his hands over the brazier and let the damp come off his gloves. Night after night they had come in, until the rookery was a storm cloud with wings. Felt wrong to cage so much sky. He set his ink near the heat but not so near as to clump, laid out the sheets he had scraped clean and cut, and read once again the sentences he had written and rewritten until they had stopped feeling like words and become a kind of prayer. The candle burned low enough to gutter when a draft crept under the door. The wax had made little lakes along the lip of the holder, and the wick had a knot in it like a knuckle. If he blew it out, darkness would be immediate and entire, as if the world beyond that tiny flame had never existed in the first place. He signed his name in a careful hand. Samwell Tarly, brother of the Night's Watch. It did not feel right, either, that last word to the south, Tarly, as if he had left a window open to let cold childhood in. When he finished the last line of the last copy, he weighted the papers with a shard of dragonglass the size of a man's thumb. Its edges bit into the parchment and caught the light not like stone but like frozen smoke. Sam's hands shook, but then his hands often shook. Fear did that. Too much fear had been like a cowl over him since boyhood. But fear, he had learned beyond the wall, could be a kind of teacher if you listened with it humming in your bones. The door eased inward on stiff hinges. Dolorous Ed put his head in, his face gray with lack of sleep or with being Ed, which was much the same. "You still at it?" "I'm done," Sam said. "Finally. I thought you'd decided to write to every goose in the 7 kingdoms. The Lord Commander wants to know when his birds can fly." "Now," Sam said, and tried to keep his voice from being a whisper. "If we wait." "I know," Ed said. "Waiting is for happy men. Give me a bundle, I'll set the boys to it." They said little else. Too many words had been spent in the last weeks on arguments at tables, in corridors, on the yard. Too many words had been flung like stones between men who had sworn the same words when they put on black. Men who did not believe in the dead until they were looking at blue eyes in a face that had been warm an hour before. Men who had never gone north of the wall and yet spoke of it as if they had breakfasted in every tree. Men who had and were not the same. He tied the letters in packets of 10, the cord biting his sore fingers. With each packet he tucked a bit of the truth inside. 1 obsidian dagger wrapped in wool, or 5 heads for arrows bound with rawhide, or a handful of flakes napped sharp as spilled light. Let them doubt words. Let them find their faith in weight and edge. "We've not birds enough for all, you know," Ed said. "Not unless the ravens start laying and hatching before dinner." "I marked the High Lords first," Sam said. "The great houses and the castles nearest the sea or the hills that might have obsidian. I wrote to Eastwatch and to the garrison at the Shadow Tower, and to Stannis Baratheon and his hand, and to Lord Commander Royce in the Vale if he still commands a levy of knights. I wrote to Horn Hill." His mouth went dry. "I wrote to my father." "7 save us," Ed said. "Better you wrote to the geese." Sam gathered up the bundles anyway. He imagined his father's face reading the letter, the contempt turning into that low amusement that was worse than anger, the smile that was knife and lesson both. He imagined the letter folded and thrust in a fire. He imagined it left forgotten on a table until the wine soaked the last of his plea and made it blur. "You killed one?" Ed said softly, as if reading the fear off him, as if fear were a book he had learned to leaf through. "Another. I've seen you, I've seen your hands. I saw what it made of your face when we came back and men called you lucky. That stopped meaning anything north of the wall. You killed it." "I did," Sam said, and the words were like ice sucked into his chest. "Or else I am mad and made it." "You are not so lucky as to be mad," Ed said. "Come." By the time they finished, the rookery sounded like a storm, a thrashing of sable. Boy after boy came and took a packet, tied leather jesses around scaled legs, stroked backs that were sleek as water. The birds took the halls like a flood. When the last one blurred into the falling snow and was swallowed, Sam stood with his hands empty and thought of little black specks fanning out over a continent, looking for eyes that could be made to see. He went to Jon then, to the Lord Commander's chamber where the fire burned low and the map of the wall swam under candlelight. Jon stood over it, his hands braced on either side as if he could hold the world steady by strength alone. The dire wolf lay against the door and raised its pale head when Sam entered, then put its muzzle down again as if to say there was little in life worth the bother. "They've gone," Sam said. Jon nodded. "It will make enemies." "Everything does," Sam said. "But if one lord listens." "If one lord listens, we have one lord more than yesterday," Jon said. "I wrote to Stannis as well. He's left Dragonstone, but he claims it still, and Dragonstone is a mountain of the stuff. If he means half what he says about true war and false wars, he'll send us ships loaded from here to Eastwatch." "It breaks," Sam said. "He'll need good nappers. It can be made into heads and knives easily enough, but not into swords. It doesn't like to be something it wasn't." "Like most men," Jon said, the faintest smile. "Tormund will leave on the morrow. I go with him. We'll try again for Hardhome. If the old mamas and the big men hear what the glass can do, if we can hand it to them, put it in their fists, maybe more will climb aboard." "They will," Sam said, because this was a place to put certainty even if he had to borrow it. "And you'll come back." "Or not," Jon said, and his face was simple and without self-pity. "If I don't mind the glass, don't let Alistair lock it in stores and lose the key. Put it into arrows if you have to sit and bind with your own hands. You're a steward, Sam. It's what you are." "When were you ever that?" Sam said. The words slipped out. The Lord Commander's mouth pressed tight, then eased. "When I had to be," Jon said. "It's no shame." He left Sam with Ghost, the map, the low fire. The wind clawed at the walls, and the sound was like a voice trying not to be a voice. Sam set his hands on the table as Jon had done and pressed down. The parchment wrinkled under his palms where long, faint lines marked old raids and old arguments and old deaths. He closed his eyes. He listened for the flutter of black wings heading south. Far away, down where pines gave way to orchards and the snow made a thin milk over winter wheat, a mailed rider pushed through slush along the King's Road with a casket bound to his saddle. His cloak snapped like a sail. When he reached the toll house, the men there took his coin, one side a stag, the other a crowned heart pierced with flame, and asked their questions because it was their job. "For the Storm King," the rider said, and if he smiled it was grim. "For Lord Stannis." They sent him on. At the crook of Blackwater Bay, cold salt wind snatched at a banner over a crenellated wall whose stones had drunk dragonfire long centuries ago. Davos Seaworth stood on the bailey and blew into his hands. The wind ate the heat as soon as it left his mouth. Men with scars and men with unscarred faces moved under him like a restless tide. Davos kept track in his head of ships as other men kept their beads. 13 true cogs and 4 shabby traders that had not seen proper caulking since King Robert's youth. A pair of longships taken off raiders in the Stepstones. A herring fleet contracted with promissory notes Stannis would one day demand payment for down to the last nail. When the Raven came, it shook water off its wings on the sill like a dog barking water off fur. A boy reached for it and flinched at the snap of its beak. "It bites," Davos said, and took the string. He untied the letter with the sort of care he'd once given to knots and nets and the big knives that gutted fish. He read slow. Letters had come later to him than hunger and knives. They required their own patience. He went directly to Stannis, though the hour was bad for news. The king stood under a sconce with his armor half on and no one to help him with the straps. He wore his frown like a helm. He listened with his chin a little lifted as Davos read the meat of it in his plain wharf voice. When Davos finished, the king put out his hand for the letter, and Davos gave it to him carefully. Stannis read again, moving lips as if tasting the words like something new in the mouth you were not sure you might swallow. "You saw it?" Stannis said at last, and his voice had a careful calm like a sheet under ice. "You were at the wall." "I saw it," Davos said. He had seen other things too. One night on the Blackwater that came back in his sleep still, the way green fire budded and bloomed like some sick flower over men who had been laughing. "I saw their dead that don't lie still, and I saw a warrior of cold break a man like kindling and freeze the air around us until metal sang. I saw the fat boy stab one of the cold men with black glass, and it shattered like a boy plunging into a pond in spring when the ice is rotten. Stannis looked at the dragonglass shard bound into the letter with twine, turned it in his fingers, brought its edge to the pad of his thumb until the skin dented and the thing seemed to want to drink blood. "Dragonstone is made of it," he said. "A mountain of it," Davos said. "Forged by fire long dead, the maesters say." The king's mouth became a thin line. "We'll put 5 ships to it at once," Stannis said. "The island is mine. It will be put to use as mines are. The watch is not a holding of mine, but the realm is, or what shall be left of it. Fishmonger bastard, send word to Claw Isle. Lord Celtigar has men and lime kills. He can set the small folk to napping while the quarries are opened. Tell him to fear me if he drags his heels. Have the ships take on as much as they can bear. And tell the watch this will be done before snow and wind can drive our coasters back to harbor." Davos had expected the order. He'd formed it in his own head and could have spoken it for Stannis, down to the threats. He kept his face still out of respect. Behind the king's shoulder, the Lord of Light's red woman watched them without moving her head. The candlelight put copper in her hair and eyes. When Davos looked at her, she smiled the way a cat smiles when you have dropped a bit of kidney before it. "The Lord's fire is not in stone," she said, "but in the heart of men. The Lord's fire should learn to chip arrowheads." Then, Davos said in his head, but what he said aloud was, "Aye, your grace," and bowed. The dragonglass went into boats like coal. Men cursed at it because it cut even through good glove leather. Men learned to nap in a day what they would have learned in a season because they had to or because fear was a teacher sharper than flint. Horn ferrules and iron sockets took stone heads and made them kiss shafts of ash and hornbeam. Tyroshi peddlers came sniffing with glue in clay pots. They left with coin and narrow eyes. Eastwatch sent word that the ice nibbled its piled stones and that the sea had a new appetite. The first coasters touched there at dusk one day when the sea went calm as if a hand had been laid upon it. Men unloaded casks by chain in a hurry that made the hidden gods laugh. Ravens flew other ways. One banged its beak upon a barred window let into the mountain above the fingers and was brought to a table where wine rings overlapped like old coins. The man who untied the cord that bound it had a mouse-quick smile and the sort of hands that always seemed to rest on something they owned, even if it was only the edge of a chair. He read while a sickly boy frowned at the ceiling and a woman of rare, dispassionate grace turned a ring on her finger to catch firelight. "The fat crow writes to everyone," the man said. "How generous. He sends gifts. How dear. How useful. What is it?" the boy demanded petulantly, not moving his eyes. His voice tripped on its own height and fell into a whine. "Stone," the man said. "Stone that kills snows made of men." "Pretty," the woman said. She did not reach for the shard. She did not reach for anything in rooms like these unless she had already calculated the taking and the return. "Will it serve us?" "It will serve someone," the man said. "Sometimes that is all we require." He turned the page to see the signature, tipped the parchment to the candle to set the edges curving black. He let it burn to his fingers before he dropped it into a bowl. "Send 100 casks to the wall. Not in my name. Jon Royce may like to do a thing so manly." "You are full of kindness," the woman said. "Kindness is a face a man puts on while he looks past it," he said. "Come." A raven flew south to a keep set among orange trees and water that kept summer in its cupped hand while snow fell elsewhere. The woman who read it wore flowing orange silk and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She called for her niece, who took the dragonglass and held it a moment, frowning at its black sheen that gave back her face as if it were someone else's. "I have no love for the north," the elder said. "But our enemies are not always the ones we would choose." "A shard of darkness with an edge," the younger said, as if to herself. "I wear one in my hair and call it a pin, and we pretend the world can be held at a woman's throat and not break. Send something to the watch. A gesture. I am fond of gestures." A black bird dropped into a courtyard where winter had not fully taken the ivy, and a girl of 10 and 2 who wore a bear on her jerkin and command on her small face took the letter, read it with her lips pressed into an older woman's lines, and went to the longhouse where her small folk ate. "We have black glass in the caves," she said. "Not much, but we'll cut it. Every spear on Bear Island will take a piece. We have no king, but we have neighbors. Send half to the wall." One crashed through the lattice of a small, neat window at Horn Hill. A man with a frown carved into his family's likeness looked up from a table with fresh-cut quills in a rank like a hedgehog. He took the letter with 2 fingers as if it might be dirty. He read. He made a sound in his throat and tossed the letter aside with a fine flick of the wrist that sent it skittering across the green felt until it came to rest near a candlestick whose base was a hound with a ruby for its eye. "Fetch the boy," he told a servant. And when they fetched the boy, he looked at him and saw that he had already left. He read again. He sent for the master-at-arms and showed him the shard. "The wall sends toys to us," he said. "We have steel." The master-at-arms turned the glass, squinted at its napped edges, and grunted, which was a language he spoke with ease. "Sharp," he said. "It shatters," Lord Randall said. "Aye," the master said, "like some men's courage. Put 2 men on it in their spare hours. Teach the little ones to flake heads by the hearth so their mothers can boast of busy fingers. I will not have this house silent when the world speaks." In King's Landing, the letter went not to a queen with a crown, but to a queen without one, who sat in a cell that smelt of stale bread and prayer, and shivered. Another found its way to the hands of a man who still wore a maester's chain, though his vows had been peeled away from him like an onion's skin. He turned the black shard in his thin hands, smiled the small, careful smile of a man who has found a new knife for his work and is still calculating which way it will cut him. "Volcanic glass," Qyburn said to the boy who had brought it. "Many names for the same thing. It likes heat and speed when it's made, and hates both when it's handled. It is not metal, yet it holds an edge like sin." His voice made everything sound like a quiet dinner. "Send my compliments to the Lord Regent. I will require some of the city's better masons' boys. Hands like theirs break less than others. And tell the king's smith that a new order will come for arrowheads, and sockets with horn sleeves. Oh, and send someone to sweep my rooms. I cannot work in dust." The boy nodded, his eyes on the glass as if it might speak. "Do not touch," Qyburn said, and the boy flinched. He wrote a short reply to the north with a hand that had never shaken and sealed it with green wax, and then he went to his chamber to touch other things that did not cry out anymore when he touched them. Word went through the riverlands like a fish in a shallow stream, quick and startling. Word went along the Iron Islands like a spark across tar. Men listened with the wrong ears. Men laughed. Men put their laughter away like clothes and went looking for stone that cut, because laughter can fail you. At the wall, carts came to the gate and rusted pins groaned. The men pulling were hunched and wrapped and turned their faces away from the wind. "From Dragonstone," the driver of the first said, and touched his brow. He had a white scar along one cheek that ran up into his hair and never came out again. Sam helped to unload. He cut his hands twice and bled a smear across his glove that looked like a letter written by someone else. When he went to bed at last, he saw shards in his sleep, brilliant as ice in winter sun, and a thin voice, saying none of this fixed anything. Then another voice saying not yet. The day John and Tormund made ready to ride for Eastwatch, Sam stood in the yard and watched. The big wildling handled a blade like a blacksmith who had found a better shop. His beard had frozen tears in it that he would never acknowledge as such. When he saw Sam, he came and clapped him on the shoulder with a hand like a chunk of iron. "Little Crow," he said, and grinned, the lines around his eyes all for pain and jokes. "You send your pretty rocks everywhere?" "Almost," Sam said. "I put a scrap in nearly every letter, so they will remember to open it." The wildling laughed. Then he stopped and leaned down to Sam, and his face was grave. "They talk still about the one you stuck," he said. "They call you the Slayer. If I catch any fool saying that in my camp, I will make him swallow a chunk of your rock so he can see what bravery tastes like. You hear me?"
Sam swallowed.
"I wasn't brave. I was alone. That is what brave is sometimes," Tormund said softly. "Come see me when I come back. I will bring you a story of Hardhome that does not make you dream of screaming boys." "I would like that," Sam said. "Bring back yourself," he added, horrified to find it unfinished at the last moment to ask something so naked. Tormund gave him something like a nod and then swaggered to his men as if the snow were an audience. Jon stood a little aside, buckling his own belt. He wore no crown. He wore a frown of thought that sat on him easier. He saw Sam and came. "Do not let them shut you up," he said. "You will be tempted to go quietly. It is a sin for us to go quiet now." "I won't," Sam said, and prayed it would be true. Jon mounted. Ghost trotted at his stirrup until he fell behind for the last moment and then went ahead with his head low to the wind. The gates yawned. The little column moved out into weather, into a world that was only whites and grays and the black thread of the road. Sam stood until the last of it faded and the wind shoved at him. He went to the armory in a kind of trance and spent the day with horn and pitch and thread and took arrowheads in his hands until they lay in rows like teeth. His knuckles bled. He kept going. The second day, Sam took his letter to the yard and read it aloud to the boys who came slow when Sam called. He read them the part about how obsidian shattered against iron and did not forgive men who forgot what it was. He read them the part about how to bind it into a ferrule so that the blow would not travel back and split the shaft. He read them the part about how if they had but 5 to spare they should give 3 to archers and 2 to men with spears because the others had armor of cold and the point in their chests was a better place to aim than their eyes. The boys nodded and blinked and asked him why he said it like that, and he said because it was true. Alistair Thorne came and looked at him a long time and said nothing and walked away, which might have been better than words. Jon and Tormund's ships sailed east along the wall like black leaves blown along a yard. They made east watch by sea in a day half calm, half foul, and the casks of glass went aboard with tatters of ice clinging to the ropes like ragged flags. Hardhome lay north and west, a warren of cliffs where the sea gnawed constantly. They had been once and come back with stories that smelled of smoke and rot. Jon sent 2 ships to scout beyond the bluffs and waited with 3 tucked under the lee of scoured rock. Snow fell that day as if the sky had been opened with a knife. The next day the snow stopped as if the sky had been stitched, and fog came instead, thick as fleece. "When we go, we cannot dally," he told Ed, who had come to ride with him to Eastwatch and then sail. Ed nodded and said he had no practice at dalliance and looked at the casks. The ice on the sea made straight lies across the water where it had no right to be, winter drawing geometry. See shapes around men as easily as a child draws cages around flies. The first whites came out of the fog scrambling on hands and feet like spiders, fast, without sound. Then the sound came all at once, from voices that had no throats left to make noise. It was not a cry, it was a remembering. The living shouted then. They always did. The first arrow that struck an other had been meant for the space between its eyes. But even a good archer cannot make a spear's head find a thought like that when the target is a moving cold dream. It hit the thing's cheek instead and skittered, shaving a sliver of frost. The other turned the way deer turn when gnats bite and lifted its hand. Then the second arrow came and Carsey had aimed lower. It went in through the thing's throat just above the collar and the obsidian head buried to the horn ferrule. The other made a sound like new ice cracking and reached for its own throat as if it had the habit of breath. Tried to draw an arrow out. The obsidian shattered in its hand and its fingers sliced themselves on the black shards and its flesh smoked. It fell down many ways at once. Ash and ice, light and sound dropping out of it like pieces from a broken cartwheel. The whites around it collapsed, legs loose under them, torsos flopping like fish dropped from a basket. They stared, everyone, and then everyone shouted at once. The next volley was better. The archers went very quiet inside themselves and did their meat work. Obsidian heads went in under ribs, through eyes, into soft places in the neck. Each time the glass drank winter, the winter died, and a fan of dead men fell around it without touching the arrow that had done it. The whites that rose again did so far from where the others crumpled, and men began to see how the fight ran in invisible lines from the cold leaders to their meat. "Shoot the men with crowns of frost," Ed shouted, and a wildling stared at him because he saw no crowns and then saw them, each a thing you felt at the corner of sight. Carsey put a dragonglass knife into the hand of an old woman who had killed 10 half-men without needing more than a stick. "If they touch you with those blades, it's like frostbite, but it burns," she said. The woman nodded as if frostbite were a man she had shared her bed with and knew his habits. The tide came in, but the sea was wrong. Bodies came with it, tumbling, broke the water's lip and dragged themselves out on hands that had been rope-burned in other lives. The giants went forward with capstan spars and kicked like men at rats. One's big foot came down on 3 at once and turned them to mess, and the mess kicked as it died. The huts caught fire because men always make fire when they should not. Smoke bent away from the living as if the air wanted nothing to do with breath. And other moved toward John with the unconcern of a man walking to fetch a tool he had left across the yard. His hair hung like icicles. Its blade was a bar of blue-white mist shaped by purpose into a sword. John drew Longclaw, and the blade looked almost dull at first compared to that icy light, until the other's sword met Valyrian steel and shrieked and shattered like glass under a hammer. The pieces fell as glitter that did not melt and never would. John stepped in and struck once across the chest and once through the throat and then once again because men are foolish and want to be sure. The other peeled apart as if men had made it of paper, and the ground beneath it went suddenly crusted with rime. The wights it had herded this way fell like dancers putting themselves into rest. They won nothing. They bought time. That was all a battle is. John thought as he put his shoulder into a giant's leg to turn the big man toward the gate and felt the long white hair of the dead brush his arm as they reached for him. He dragged back children with their faces streaked where snot had frozen and women whose ankles bled under the rawhide thongs of their boots and men who kept going because they had made a bargain with their own breath at the start of the day and it still had to be paid. "Back!" Tormund bellowed. His voice cracked bloody with the work of yelling. "Back, you goat botherers! Onto the bloody boats! It's a long life on the sea if you live to take a step onto it." They formed a line of archers knelt in the snow where the village met the beach, and they shot until their arms shook and the bowstrings sang like harp strings grew old and broke. They hit 3 others in the last minutes and watched the ice men open like old wounds and the whites around them collapse. It was like finding a rhythm in sawwork, and men got mad with that rhythm even as they fell back because they had found a way to make death keep time for once. He was the last of his boatload to jump aboard. The ship rocked and hands grabbed his arms and dragged him over the rails. He fell into the scuppers and lay there some moments feeling would bite into ribs, feeling the sea reach up to claim him and be denied. He got up because men were shouting his name and he seemed to be the man with the answers. He turned and looked back. Up on the ridge in silhouette were the others, for of them 5, 6, ranks as neat as any lord's guard watching their lords ride past. Behind them, in a space where snow did not fall, something waited like a thought men did not have the words for. The boats drifted and then caught the pull. The water was a muscle under them and dragged them as if it had a will. On shore the dead poured over old walls and around fallen timbers as if such things had never been built. The living slammed oars into their beds and heaved. The wind came into their faces with smoke and the stink of meat cooked badly and the sweet rot of fish when you haul a net in slow and most of your catch has gone to slime. The figure on the ridge lifted its arms. The silence then in John's head was complete enough to be a kind of ringing. On the beach the bodies why had left behind jerked. Men who had thrown their weight into oars held still and watched people they had known 5 minutes ago come to their feet with a wrongness that filled the world to its edges. Some of the living made sounds like breaking pots. Other men did not make a sound because all sounds had been used up. Arrows hissed. Some of the ones who had risen went down under shafts through the eye. 1 or 2 made sneering smacks when metal kissed bone. But most of the dead simply stepped through the arrows as if they were reeds in a river. On another day, on a day without glass, it would all have ended there, men and kids and women in the water among broken boats, with no more choice in them than twigs. But 3 arrows went, by luck and by hands that had learned something in 3 hours hands do not usually learn in 3 years, into 3 pale faces above on the ridge. Obsidian heads went into throats. Black glass vanished in winter. The 3 others fell apart and spilled dead out of their hands. The whites at the waterline drooped, stumbled, dropped with their heads turning at strange angles, drowned again. Jon did not shout. He nodded once as if to a fact, then turned and put his energy into rowing. "Pull," he said. "Pull and don't stop. Look at your hands if you need to, but don't look back. Pull." They lost most still. He knew that. But the boats bore more than they had, and those boats made more weight in the water than they should have. And in the end of the day there were 20 women with elbows and sharp eyes who had not expected a next day, and there were 12 boys with ears red with cold, and 4 old men who had decided a long time ago not to die on the sea and found themselves doing it anyway. There were fewer widows than there might have been in a world without black glass. It was a small calculus. You learned to cheat figures when you could. They came in to Eastwatch under a sky-threatening squalls. The watchmen on the sea tower peered down and held lanterns to their ears as if they were listening to light. Men stumbled off boats into a confusion of labor. Hands reached, orders fell like snow. In the crush a child went to her knees and began to eat snow with her mouth held very exactly as if this were her job. No one could stop her at first because the air had gone mushy around them. Finally an old woman took the child's head in both hands and said something into her ear. The child stood and bit her lip and stood. It was more work than most men have ever done, that standing. Jon went and found a spare patch of wall and leaned against it with his eyes closed for a count of 40. Then he went in and found the quartermaster and put his hands on the table long enough to feel the splinters. "Get word to Castle Black," he said. "Send south to the long garrisons. Send to the Shadow Tower. We brought more than we thought. We lost more than we thought. The glass kills the others. Kills them easy. We need more shafts and more ferrules and resin. If you have anything left you can grind into powder and put into glue to help it bite, do so. I don't care if it's your mother's combs." The quartermaster was a small man with skin like oiled leather and no hair left to be gray with. He nodded and began to write with one hand while he reached for casks with the other as if he could move two-headed. "More," he said. "Always more. It is a good word because it is the only one we have." Ravens went again. Some dropped into snowdrifts and did not rise. Some were eaten by hawks that were tired of sickly rabbits. Some reached their places and brought men to tables with their hands on the wood, and their faces turned the way men's faces turn when war comes north and then keeps coming. At Winterfell, a man with the shape of a smile cut with a knife into his face read the letter without sitting. He rolled the shard in his palm, watching it make faint black licks in the candle flame. "Glass," he said mildly. "Send a man to retrieve some, if we can steal it from the wall. My father liked trophies. I like useful things." His woman's hair came down like shadow under his hand as he touched it without looking at her. "Fetch my hounds," he told a servant later, because there were always other hungers. At Castle Black, the gates shook open and the confused noise that follows success came in like weather and took up lodging in every corner. They made fires, too many and too close to walls, because heat feels like proof of living more so than breath. Sam went among them, telling men not to set the wall alight and to leave pathways for carts because carts save as many as swords do, and taking the measure with his eye of what they had lost. He saw Tormund grin like a cut in meat. He saw Ed sit down and lean against a barrel with his mouth open like a fish, and sleep with his eyes partly open until someone tripped over his feet and he woke and apologized to them as if he were the one who had done the falling. Jon found Sam in the rookery, as if it were a room at the heart of him. "We hit them," Jon said, and then he sat down and put his head in his hands because a man may be Lord Commander and still be a boy who once lay in the straw in a stable at Winterfell and wept because a pup would not drink. "I know," Sam said. "I've been writing it down in my head and then I put it on paper while I could. I wrote to Old Town too. The Conclave will hate me for it. I said the words I am not supposed to use with the authority I do not have." "Good," Jon said. He lifted his head. "They will hate you. Better to be hated for the right things." "Is there such a thing?" Sam said, then wished he had not. Ghost pushed the door with his nose and made himself long along the wall near the brazier, where he was only 2 shades lighter than the heat. "Stannis sent glass," Jon said. "So did Bear Island," Sam said. "And the Vale." The Vale sent men to the outfitter at Gulltown to shape ferrules and sleeves. The loot. Tur came from Bronze Yone, but it was sealed with Littlefinger's crest. I think that means he wishes to be thanked without being exposed to the debts of thanks. Then don't thank him, Jon said. Thank the smiths. Thank the boys who cut their fingers and bled into the glue. All right, Sam said. He found himself smiling a little for the first time in a week and then pressing his mouth flat because smiling felt like theft. I wrote to my father. I don't know why I thought that would help, but I did. Maybe he will send nothing, Jon said. And maybe he will send 1,000 shafts because he wants to be the man who did it when other men did not. It is a kind of pride, too. We can use pride like we use wind. I thought pride only sank ships, Sam said. It depends where it blows, Jon said. I want to send for more men to quarries. Put any beast to hauling that can walk. Don't let Thorn keep the stores under lock if the locks slow us. I'll put it under my key, Sam said, and I will lose my key often as needed. He hesitated, and then offered up the prayer he had put aside earlier. You came back. For now, Jon said. The night's not done. Cersei Lannister received nothing because she could receive nothing in those days except from men who held keys. The letter that would have been hers went to a servant who turned it over in his hands and took it to another servant who burned half of it and mislaid the rest. Qyburn's note went instead to a small council chamber where no one with real power sat but decisions collected like crumbs. The little black shards he had requested began to be made in the cellars of the city. They found a flint napper in a camp of hedge knights and paid him with wine and stew to sit in a doorway and make little things out of dark glass with the same motions he had used for years to make nothing anyone wanted. He had a bad cough and a fine patience. Ratty boys watched him and learned without knowing they were learning. In the Vale, a knight of old bronze, face hammered with temper, put on a cloak and went to his men. He did not like the man who ruled the boy who was supposed to be lord, but he liked the idea of fighting a real enemy in the right direction, and the news from Hardhome turned old anger into an instrument. Pack tents and wool and iron and flints, he told his men. Not banners. We go to put hands where men need hands. In White Harbor, Lord Manderley held the shard up like a sweet meat. His double chins made soft, clever waves as he turned it in light he treasured like any good thing. Send some of our own, he said. We have sailors, we have knives. Let men in the merman's court who like to boast of a sea's bounty pay for ships to go up the coast with casks. This will taste better than gold when they tell the tale after. In a muddy camp between trees that had no leaves left to shake, a girl in gray furs sat on a stump and sharpened a thin blade in such even strokes that a man who had once served her father stopped watching only because he could not stand the sound. We'll be at the wall when they are ready, Brienne of Tarth said softly, not to the girl but to the thought of the girl's mother who lived in her head as warning and instruction both. We will see that the girl goes where she is safest, which might be nowhere, but she had the muscle for it. She had made a life of pushing like a river against stones. The raven that reached Old Town woke a rookery with 10,000 years of sleep caked in its stones. The tower that had learned to look at the sea and count ships by the way their wakes lay behind them got a black fleck at its lip. And a boy who had come to be a maester so he could be near candles and be allowed to read walked as slow as he could to take the letter to the conclave because men only rarely get to enjoy dread the proper way. He was brought to a long table where rings clinked and coughs were old men's punctuation. Sam had written of obsidian and the others. He had written of his own deed not as boasting but as proof, and with footnotes citing days and times and names. He had written with grace whatever else might be said of him. The maesters looked at one another with all the old learning of the world balanced across their throats. Children's tales, one said, with love in his voice because he loved tales. Tales that get men killed, said another. His evidence speaks against him, a third said. A boy frightened too often. Send word to the wall that we are convened, said an old man whose chain had iron and gold in equal measure. We will put a committee to it. We have put committees on death before, someone murmured. Right saying that obsidian has surgical uses, another said, eager because knives were more interesting than Winter's. It can cut without bruising, tender tissue, clean as light. Then cut yourself and show us, the first said, and someone coughed, which served. They wrote something politer than the contempt some felt, softer than the fear others suspected. They told Samwell Tarly to keep careful records, as if he had not been keeping careful records since he had learned to pull a string on a latch. They sent nothing useful. A boy from a kitchen brought in pies. The maesters ate and licked their fingers with the absent-mindedness of men who mean to live forever. In the cold camp of a king whose stores were running down like a clock, a girl stood at the edge of a world and looked at her father's face and tried to find the thing that men had told her was love when they talked about fathers. She did not find it. She found a mouth set against the weather, and eyes that had learned to live with pain and to count with it. She found a frown for which she could not feel tender. Davos, banished, was not there to say the right thing and be wrong and be forgiven for it. The men moved about the camp with the quiet that precedes necessary cruelty or necessary mercy. Men do not always know the difference until later. Word of Hardhome, of the arrowheads that made winter bleed, reached even there. Stannis looked down at the shard someone had brought him from a coaster and then up at the sky that had gone gray with its own exhaustion. He did not turn his boots south. He did not turn them north. He did not turn at all yet. He stood and balanced possibilities as if they were coins he could stack. In his mind, the Dragonglass arrowheads went into the hands of his men when they took Winterfell and the dead came afterward. In his mind, the Dragonglass arrowheads went to the Watch and his men went to the snow to lie down forever. It was not the easiest of balances to maintain. He did it anyway because no one else would. At the wall, with the sea salt still drying in the cracks of wood from the boats, they set to. The yard became a place where black glass grew in stacks like jet fungi. Sam worked until his eyes watered and his back snarled. He taught boys to bind and to melt and to grind because no one in Old Town would teach them, and in the nights when he could not sleep for the wind he wrote catalogs. He wrote a list of nappers who were good enough to trust the final finish to. He wrote a list of families to be moved south of the wall if the others came faster than glass could be napped. He wrote a list of words that must be said in the letters that would be written over his signature so that no foolish lord would only hear insult. He wrote with his father's shadow over his shoulder and tried to be the sort of man who could be proud of a son who signed his name with mud on his boots and blood on his knuckles and glass dust under his nails. "Ollie, not like that," he told the boy with the dark brows and the ripe anger. "Bind it lower, or the recoil will pop the socket." Ollie said nothing and did as he was told, and looked up at Jon when the Lord Commander came by without meaning to be obvious. Sometimes, being a boy meant a man in black looked large enough to cram into the hole a dead father had left. By the 7th day after Hardhome, they had 2 casks ready for East Watch, 3 for the Shadow Tower, and half a cask marked for the gift of Queen Celis, words written that way because it cost nothing to flatter and not much to tell truth on top of it. A raven came, battered, with a note pinned with twine to its leg that said 3 words in Davos's hand. "More is needed." Sam smiled silently at the table. "We have the right language," he said to the candles. Finally, after the 8th day, things became complicated again in the way of snowballs rolling downhill. The first men reached the wall's guard posts with no boots, just rags, and they stared at the black glass as if it were food and tried to put it in their mouths and then apologized when they bled. The first letter came from a lord in the Reach, sealed with a sword and a ripple of water, asking for 100 heads as proof because his men had been sharpening flint and treating it as good. The first merchant came from White Harbor with chips of obsidian strung like beads and offered them to young wives as charms to keep the cold out of babies. Sam bought the man's stock and broke the beads and said nothing. "Fate is a stupid gambler," Ed said, tallying stocks at his elbow. "But it makes the night pass." "You are cheerful," Sam said. "Someone has to be," Ed said. He showed Sam the tally. "I'll lie in the right direction if you tell me which way to lie." "No lies," Sam said. "Just faith." And Ed looked at him and then at the winter sky and then back as if to say the gods were cruel to put such words into such mouths. Jon slept 4 hours out of 20, not in a row. In those hours he dreamed not of the sea making bodies stand but of a room at Winterfell where the air had smelled of hot bread and of a girl with brown hair. He woke and went to the yard and drilled boys until it seemed that pain was a small thing under his feet like straw that can be ground into nothing. When men came to him to say that Thorne had blocked them from the stores, he walked there and took the keys. When men came to him to say that the wildlings were stealing glass, he said, "Of course they are. We are all stealing from the future to pay for this now. Watch that they steal properly." And men stared at him and decided to hate him harder later. He went again to the sea, to the hall at Eastwatch where the fish stank and where the ships breathed and strained as they rose and settled in the swells. He put the second wave of glass into hands that had expected only bad luck, and he watched those hands close around it. He learned the names of the men who could shoot as if they had always been meant to. A boy with a mouth twisted by some old illness could put 3 in the throat at 40 paces, and he gave that boy a cloak without holes. A girl with a black tattoo under one eye that marked her a thief in a city he did not know more about than the idea of it could make heads go where they were meant to, and he put her near Tormund and told men to listen when she spoke. They made new runs up the coast and hauled back children and old men who would eat little and require small space and tell stories that made boys lie awake with both dread and hunger. They shot 3 more others and watched their slaves fall. There were ghosts in every corner now, not in the old sense but in the sense that men had learned to see places where air liars curled like steam from a cut. They'd shoot into those lies when they could, and sometimes black glass found a body that hadn't seemed to be there. It made a man think hard about his own body and what it meant to take up space. They slept under the wall in piles. One snored and shook off snow like a dog shakes off rain. The dogs warred beneath the carts for bones. Ghost stood in the yard and scented and turned his head to places men could not see. On the 9th day the weather broke like a promise. The wind came straight out of the north with no curl in it. The sea clenched. The wall sang, a thin, high sound of cold in a big stone. Ravens came fast and one tumbled as if a hand had swatted it out of the air and hit in the yard with its wings making little flags. Sam ran and took it up and pulled the string from its leg even as the bird clawed him in worry. He read the few words. Ships sighted off Skagos. No sal. Men walking. He took it to John. John read and did not blink. They are testing the sea, he said softly, or learning they can use it. It doesn't much matter which. We'll be hit from the east, or from the west, or both. Send to the Shadow Tower to watch the hills. Send to the Flint Cliffs. I want men sleeping in their boots, arrow bundles tied in dozens so they can be carried by boys. If there's a god for luck, tell him we have tried not to offend him lately. That god laughs when we say his name, Sam said. He thought of the boy with the good bow, the girl with the thief's tattoo. He thought of Gilly with the baby and of the way the baby's hand went slow and exact along a blanket as if the only thing in the world that needed nursing was wool. He went to the rookery again and called for ink and for sand and for boys and for a new set of quills and for Ed to please stop scaring the half-grown ravens with that face. He wrote until his eyes crossed and he was afraid his letters would start crawling off the page like poor beetles. The first wave of dead that reached Eastwatch by sea came like flotsam pushed by a bored child. Bodies washed up and then became things again and clawed the rocks and had to be beaten back with axes. Men treated it like a job. Jobs can be done. John kept the big dogs on the walkways. They would howl when a mass of dead pressed in from a direction men could not watch all at once. A dead thing that has been long underwater is slicker than any living thing men ever fight. They learn to bind rags around their gauntlets and to change those rags often. Dragonglass arrowheads do not love fishgut. That night, as if to show the first had been a small amuse-bouche, the others came themselves. Slender on the ice floes like boys playing dare, they leaned and put their long cold weight into the air and called. The call was not sound. It was a pressure around the ears. Men went to their knees like dogs pushed onto cartons. John felt his throat close for a moment and then open again because his body was a traitor who had learned the tricks of breath and wanted to keep it. He grabbed an archer's shoulder and said, Now, your heads, not the whites, the pale men, there. It was like Hardhome but cleaner and worse. They had glass and they had men who knew how to use it, and they had walls they could fall back to. But the enemy was the sea and the cold itself, not just what walked on it. The others did not have to break the gate at Eastwatch. They only had to keep men running until breath became a coin you dropped without knowing. But they were used to being unshot at from the top of walls. The first volley came and 3 ghosts fell into their own reflection. the ice around them fluffy white with frost shot upward in a rime that looked like hair. The whites surrounding them sagged. The ones behind stepped over, because the dead have no respect for any other weight. "Keep it," Jon said, and he and Ed and Carsey's good archer and the thief girl together breathed the fight into a rhythm. The watchmen and wildlings learned. They put black heads into cold flesh and watched it take the cold flesh apart. Giants dragged logs up beside the sea and rolled them down, and the whites went end over end into the water and thrashed in blazing piles if someone remembered to have fire there at the right moment. And if the fire were too late, they just made a blocking heap and learned to step where the water ate more slowly. It was like learning to farm a field that tried to bite back. They held. Men fell. One of the giants died with an arrow in his eye that had been meant for another on the horizon. And the air made that small fish mouth shape men make when a thing breaks in the wrong hands. But they held. They put the glass into the right places, and the cold men fell apart, and the whites around them fell into themselves and became nothing interesting to fight, just meat. The others learned not to come so close to the walls, and the whites learned to fetch. The whites came back with long bleached timbers and began to lay them in the water like a causeway. Men shot at them, and the whites dropped and rose again, and the timbers floated close and then closer, bumping and turning and sometimes sinking under a heap of eager dead. "They build," Sam said, watching from the walkway with his hands buried in his cloak and a shock in his voice that would have been a laugh if laughter had been permitted. "With intelligence." "Not much," Ed said. "Just enough." That was bad enough. Then came the thing with the sea. It began to glass over in a strange green way, not like winter, not like the first skim of ice in a puddle in a road, but like a thought the others had that spread outward. Men watched waves become flat in an instant and then spiky as instant boiling. Some shouted sorcery. Some shouted prayers. Some got on with their work. The others stepped out on their new floor and the world rang. Arrows went. The first 2 arrows struck and killed 2 pale men, and those around them shuddered and let fall the lines they had been drawing with long driftwood poles. "Never seen the sea take orders," an old fisherman muttered, and then, "Once it takes them, it might not stop." As if he were talking about his own wife, the dead turned away after an hour. It had not been a battle in the way men told them later. It had been a negotiation, and the price had been set as sorcery's price always is, too dear, even if you pay it. Sam stood with Jon afterward in the lee of the sea tower where the air did not be. Low as hard and the stink of dead fish did. "Letters," Jon said. "Yes," Sam said. "I want the Vale," Jon said. "And White Harbor. I want the Mormonts and the mountain clans. I want any lord who has more pride than sense, and I want to bind it like a sheaf of arrows. I want them to see this. Send to them and say they can come and look. Let them bring their maesters and their cooks. Let them sleep in our beds and curse the cold. Let them see the sea misbehave." "And to the south?" Sam asked. "Send to all," Jon said. "You did it once. Do it again. Say it louder. Tell them the ocean froze like a thought. Tell them we are holding with glass with glue. Tell them Stannis sent and Royce sent and Manderley sent. Tell them to be better than men they hate." He paused. "Tell them that any man who comes will need to leave his banners by the gate. I want their spears and their bows and their good tempers. If they bring bad temper, I shall put it to work hauling shit." Sam stood with the wind pushing at his belly and nodded. He could already feel the words in his hand, the way a good knife has weight you can sense even when it is on the table and your eyes are closed. He would write of Hardhome and the ridge with the pale men watching, and he would write of black heads entering winter throats. He would write of the sea turning to false floor, and he would write of children eating snow in a precise way as if they had been hired for it and had pride. He would write of a girl with a thief's tattoo who managed to shoot while laughing and of a giant who rolled logs. He would put everything that smelled of truth into the letters and send them where men kept their stiff hands on goblets and tried to ignore the season. He would send shards again with each letter. He would waste glass to make words heavier. He did not care if it was waste. He would waste anything not nailed down to buy a handful of days. The day the First Lord came was cold enough to split lips if you smiled. Yohn Royce came in his bronze, shovel-jawed, with men at his back who liked to hold a line. He bore himself as if none of this amused him and he would do it anyway, which was hope made into flesh for the first time in weeks. With him came a manderly second son already fat and merry and ready to feed men with pies because pie is a message as clear as any letter. With them came a handful of small men out of the hills who had strange tartans and what they called honor mixed with an even stranger practicality. "We heard glass hurts winter," one said. "We'll hurt winter then. We know how to set glass." In their train, far behind, came a southern banner that snapped like a challenge in a wind that did not care what it snapped. Lord Randall Tarley came like a knife polished too much. He wore disdain like a good cloak and examined the wall the way a man admires a horse he would not buy. He read the posts in the yard and the bundles of arrows with a cold eye for plunder and for pride both. He watched men take dragonglass in their fingers and not break it. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke to Sam, he did not say his name. He said, "I imagine you did not leave your spoon halfway in the stew pot this time." "I left it in," Sam said, amazed to find he had a mouth. "I left it in and stirred and stirred and stirred." His hands were steady. All the trembling had gone into his voice, and then out of it, and then into the wind to be carried off. "My wife has made busy work for our little girls with some black glass of her own," Randall said, as if mentioning a clever hound. "It kept them quiet, which is something." "Thank her for me," Sam said, and saw a curious movement in his father's mouth, as if the thing there to be said had lodged in the wrong bit of throat. Then it passed. The Lord walked away. They watched the sea together, that odd collection of men who had not planned to occupy the same wind at the same time. They watched it with the old attention given to gods and to women in window seats, and to fires when the night is thick. When the dead tried again, they all moved the same way at once, a small step forward to where the parapet was lowest. The pale soldiers came skimming, and the arrows went and the glass did its mean work. John watched the play of it and thought of things not in his head yet, plans that came in question marks like birds and settled for a moment, then went up again. He thought of sending a ship to Dragonstone to not just receive glass but to take men back who could teach with their hands while they taught with their mouths, nappers and chippers and boys with cuts on every finger who had gotten good between bite and stitch. He thought of a summer that seemed like a lie and how much easier it was to feed a lie than to eat it. He thought of winter, and how the word had once been a proverb and now was a person with eyes. When night dropped entirely, it did not become darker. It became thicker. Men took bowls of stew under the walkway piles and ate with the greedy care of men who may not eat again soon. The wind pushed at the flames and the flames pushed back and no one broke. Tormund told a tale filthy enough to wipe the cold off a man's ears for a factor of minutes. And then he told one quiet as an old woman's hands moving in a bowl of dough, about a winter the children of the forest had endured when the stars had gone out for 3 nights and you could hear insects walking under the snow. He admitted frankly he had never heard insects walk under the snow, but he liked the sound of it. A boy did not laugh, and his face did not move at all, and his eyes had goes in them that will never go. He had seen Hardhome. Sam sat beside him and did not tell him it would be all right. He told him where to hold the bow. The boy's hands did better work after that. The next morning, with frost like glass breath on every plank, a raven arrived with a letter from the south that was too much like silk. The seal bore, Yalayo. The hand belonged to a lord who could write a threat with courtesy and who enjoyed the trick. It said that if the crown were to send 1,000 black-fletched arrows with heads as described and men trained to use them, the watch would owe this and would owe that, and the world would be precisely the same afterward, only with more lions. John read it and handed it to Ed without comment. Ed read it and snorted. "We are finally being taken seriously by those who make their lives an art of not taking anything seriously," he said. "The end times must indeed be here." "Right back," John told Sam. "Say yes to the arrows and say that in return we owe not tongues nor stockfish nor any particular loyalty beyond the one we already carry. Say that in exchange we will owe them a chance to look their grandsons in the face and say we did not die like men who did not understand. Say it differently," he amended. "Better." "I will," Sam said, already thinking of the words. He had become a sort of smith himself, and the clang of it was in his bones, a rhythm now almost as steady as fear used to be. He wrote by day and by night. He sharpened a knife and his pen both. He did not sleep when letters had to fly. Things worsened and improved by turns in the next weeks. Men grew handy with glass, and glass grew shorter in piles. The dead showed the wit of a wolf and then the stupidity of a bee. The sea learned a new trick and then forgot it when the wind backed strangely and spoiled the page. The work of weather is more complicated than sorcery. Men discovered, and sometimes more forgiving. Royces and Manderleys and rough men of no name at all learned how to say Dragonglass without sneering, and then they learned how to shout Dragonglass, like an order that could be obeyed by hands and by intention both. A little fleet of gull-gray cogs went to Dragonstone and to Claw Isle and to wherever cliffs had spat black glass in an age when the world was angry. Men who had never held anything useful in their hands except maybe a plow held it now and learned the old truth. That a blade gives a man a sense of certainty even when all it gives him is a better way to die. When Stannis finally moved, he did it with the grit of a man who had forced his own body to answer to him for years. He sent his wife south to Castle Black with the child and men enough to make it less an insult and more a choice, even if the woman did not see it that way, which she absolutely did not. He burned fewer statues. He burned fewer men. He kept his council wound tight around him like an old cloak and marched to meet a foe that had the advantage of walls and of supplies and of treachery inside those walls and of his own body's waning. It went how such things go. He died in snow or lived beyond it, depending on which man told the tale in which camp months later to get a drink bought for him. It did not change the small truth on the ice at Eastwatch. That glass could make light of winter for just long enough for a man to take one more breath. A boy came to Sam and said there was someone to see him, and he went out and found a girl with leaf-brown hair and boots worth more than he had ever held at once, and an expression like a question that had been sharpened on both sides. She asked him how the black glass was made sharp, and he showed her with his hands and watched her watch. She thanked him in a voice that was neat, and then she was gone with a big woman at her shoulder like a moving door. Sam stood very still after and tried to remember something he had read in a book about swords with names and about girls with better steel in them than most men had. Another boy came to Sam with a face bluer than the cold and said there was a man at the gate who said he had a seal that men had liked once on the Blackwater and had learned to fear. Davos Seaworth came in with salt hard in the cracks of his hands, and with a knowing sorrow in his eyes that made Sam think of men who had learned to load their pockets with rocks, and then walk into a river to see if the gods were in need of either rocks or pockets. Davos put a satchel down on Sam's table and opened it to show Lannisport gold scripted with promises and gossip. "This will buy more glue," he said. "It will buy horned ferals. It will buy men who think of their hands as commodities." "Thank you," Sam said, "because there was no better." Davos nodded and said without being asked that the island gave up more with gentle hands than with goats, that you must be patient with rocks the way you are with wives, that there were men in Lys who could teach a boy to flake glass who had never learned to flake anything except wine out of a skin. He said Stannis had gone and things had been done and undone, and there was no use to unbaking a loaf once it went in the oven. He looked toward the sea as if to see a little boat he had lost once. Then he shook his head and the movement removed sorrow like a coat. "I'll get you more," he said, "until there's none left to get. My king would approve. Even if he did not, I would. You do not need kings to tell you the difference between right and wrong when the air is this cold." "I thought that too," Sam said, and it surprised him into smiling. "Once I thought I needed my father to tell me. Then I thought I needed books. Now I think I need birds." "Birds and knives," Davos said. "Men can make do with little else. I'll take a barrel of the small heads with me for the Vale men." "Take two," Sam said, drunk on generosity, and Davos laughed softly, like a man who has seldom been presented with more than he asked and knows what to do with the rare gift. On a night when the sky was clear enough to show stars and the stars looked like the bones of birds in the cold, the others came again. They came not to test but to make a thing. They put whites on rafts and sent them into the harbor with ropes like a schoolboy's idea of siege. Men shot the ropes when they saw them, and the ropes bled water and the rafts swung wide and burned. The faint blue line out to the horizon where you could always imagine the end of the world crept closer in the eye. Men traded their last jokes. They shot. They discovered that if they put glass dust into the glue the heads set better. and that if they fletched with short thick feathers the arrows flew straighter in crosswinds. These discoveries came with names: Jory's glue, Thistle's fletch, because men like to tag their hope with their own names even when they don't know they are doing it. When it ended that time, it ended because the others lost interest, or because the sea stirred like a man turning over in his sleep and crushed their causeways where logs had been laid, or because the gods were tired of watching. Jon did not care which. He went to the rookery with Sam, and the two of them stood there looking at birds asleep like soot. "When this is done," Jon said, and did not finish. Not because he did not know what to say, but because saying it felt like counting coin you did not have. "When this is done," Sam said, helping him, "we will have to make the South believe it was not a tale. We will have to tell the tale anyway. They will call it pretty and untrue," Jon said. "They will call it their own," Sam said, a little smile. "Which might be worse, or better. I do not know. Do you remember the first arrow that hit an other at Hardhome?" Jon asked. "Carses," Sam said. "Ido." I remember thinking that the throat was a decent target for a man not named for archery. I remember thinking her face looked bored, because everything important looks like work to people who have done it too long. "That is what I will say," Jon said. "You will say nothing," Sam said. "I will say it. They will listen to the man who owns the words even if they want to hang the man who holds the sword. They are funny like that." He put his hand flat on the table, next to a shard of dragonglass that had rolled there and stopped as if it had been told to. "I will write it so. I will make the truth into a shape they can carry." He did. He wrote the making of the arrowheads into a recipe, and the feeling of the cold into an anecdote, and the art of aiming into a story with a punchline. He wrote the sending of ships into a line of sums, and he wrote of Bear Island's girls napping glass with mouths tight, and of a boy named after a bird who shot as if his arms knew a separate god. He wrote of a sea that took orders, and of a day when the orders fell on the floor and broke and were replaced by other orders, because men cannot live in terror forever without making a song of it. He wrote and sent and wrote and slept a little and woke to the rattling of the rookery like winter rain. He dreamed, the few times he slept, of weight and edge and winter breaking in the throat like a thought interrupted. Once, late, he held the last shard in the room up to the lamp and looked through it. The world became wobbled, spilled, beautiful and cruel. He turned it and watched his own hand become a river, and the flame a tear, and the low hum of the castle a kind of voice. He lowered it, and the world returned as itself, cruel and beautiful and in need of small stubborn things. He set the shard down as gently as if it were a living thing. "I always thought a cure-all was a liar's phrase," he said softly, to himself and to the night. "But sometimes there is a small cure that reaches a long way if you throw it hard enough." The raven nearest him stirred and muttered, and then put its head under its wing as if to say that was enough of that for now. He went back to work. He put one last dagger into one last packet for one last unknown man. He did not think of his father again, or not for long. He thought of throats and of cold and of glue and of the way boys' hands learn. He thought of wind. He thought of the figure on the ridge at Hardhome, the way it had lifted its hands. He thought of the way another fell when glass bit it. He thought of how men learn to make a habit of what saves them until the habit feels like a nature. Winter did not end. It did not get better for a very long time. Men fell. Lovers parted. Children grew. The dead came and came again. The sea obeyed and then argued and then obeyed. Glass wore down and had to be made anew, and men's fingers looked like meat that had put up a poor fight. But there were nights when the wind was wrong for the dead and the arrows were right for the living. And in those nights the little black heads pinned winter where it stood. There were days when little boys brought small bundles of heads in their arms and laid them down with the arrogance of men, and men gave them cloaks because of it. There were meals eaten hot. There were laughs, obscene and tender. There were stories made whose greatest sin was their brevity. There were moments when Jon Snow looked at the sea and felt something like belief that was not foolish and not expensive. There were pages with Samwell Tarly's hand on them, pages that went to places where candles burned perfumed, and men put them aside for later and then picked them up again because something in the writing made them think of their own sons. There were splinters of glass in sacks under beds in King's Landing and in Horn Hill and in Bear Island and in rooms in towns that did not know their own names. There were ferrules made in Gulltown with careful hands. There was glue with glass dust in it that had a different smell and set in a different weather. There were archers who had never shot anything but a badger through a back garden's hedge and now thought of a pale throat. "My lord," Sam wrote, "my lady, the thing we have is not a miracle. It is not a sword for a king. It is not a song you can sing and make the winter go. It is a shard of black that wounds winter when you put it in the right place. I send you one so your hand will know it, and I send you instructions for binding, and I send you the names of men who can teach other men the trick. We will hold if we hold together. If you send men, send them without letters of grudge and with their hands already nicked from work. If you send glass, send it in barrels and not in jewelry. If you send nothing, send the wish that your grandson will be told a true story of this winter while he sits by a fire. We will turn the tale into truth for him." He signed his name the way he had that first night, but this time he wrote only Samwell, as if he were sending his old name out to all the places he had left and telling it to make itself useful. The letters went out. The birds rose like a black storm going against a white one. In the end, the tide came in and went out, and the dead learned all they could and the living learned more, because they were forced to, and because they had the small stubborn luxury of a little piece of stone that insisted on being the right shape at the right moment. Dragons might come to burn the dead. Kings might come to kneel in the snow. Prophecies might be spoken and broken. But in the icy yards of Eastwatch and Castle Black and on the frozen dunes near the Shadow Tower, men killed winter with black glass and went on breathing. They did not clap themselves. They did not make songs. They missed dinner and ate when they could. They loved each other and they hated each other, and they took orders from the sea when it made sense, and they told the sea to go hang when it did not. They were what men are in winters: persistent, foolish, good. Sam slept one night with his head on a sheaf of paper and woke with ink on his cheek and a raven tugging at his hair because it had mistaken it for straw. He lifted his head and laughed in a way that sounded like coughing until it did not. He went to the window and opened it just enough to let the morning pour in like something cheap and precious. Far out, the horizon had that line again, the one a man could mistake for the end of everything. He knew it was not that. There is never an end of everything visible to the eye. There is only work and the little black thing that helps you do it. He put his fingers on the shard once more and then walked with it to the armory. Not like a miracle, not like a secret, but like a nail, like a hinge, like a stitch. He put it in a boy's hand and showed him where it went. On another day, perhaps in some south too warm for such a thought, men would call what they had done here cleverness. On that day it was just life. They did it again, and again, and again, until the sound of Dragonglass being bound into horn and shaft became a steady music under winter, the way a mother hums a stupid, perfect tune in a hard house, and the child lives long enough to remember it.